is, but he's saying, I just on purpose choose to see it this way. Now, quickly here, let's see, what do I want to do? Let's just, let's just sum it up. I got two little verses to read to you. Galatians chapter 3. Let's just cut a little short. I just want to read you these. Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. I want to read this to you from the Message. In the light of what we just said. Now, the Galatians had the same problem for Paul that the Corinthians had. People came in after he left. Now, Galatians is not a city, it's a region. These cities of Galatia. And people came in, and I'll just be honest with you, reading the book of Galatians, we can tell what it was they were telling them. You need to obey the Jewish law. You need to be circumcised. That's what they were telling them. You need to be circumcised and obey the Jewish, because that's commanded as an initiation into Judaism. And these people that came in didn't believe you could just go from being a Gentile to being a Christian. They thought you had to be a Jew first and obey the Jewish law, and then you can add Christ on top of that. Paul said that's just, you might as well boast about your own righteousness. It's not Jesus plus everything you do, it's Jesus and only Him. Did we notice that from what he said? I'll tell you what, Phil, I changed my mind. Chapter 5, go to, and King James. I want to show you this first. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And the yoke of bondage that he's talking about, if you read the previous chapter, is the Mosaic Law. Go on reading the next verse. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now again, they were being told you need to be circumcised, and that is a token or a sign of submission to the Jewish law. He says, I'm telling you, if you're going to go that route, then you don't need Christ. Because when you're strong, you don't need Christ. But when I'm weak, then the power of Christ rests. You see how this affected his thinking and everything. I testify again. He's just emphasizing this. Every man that is circumcised, he's a debtor to do the whole law. Now, if you want to see something scary, read the next verse. Christ has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. Well, that's pretty scary, isn't it? Why does he say you're fallen from grace? Because he said back there, remember we read it, he said, the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. See, he said, that's all I need to depend on is His grace. And so I count myself weak that the power of Christ might rest upon me. He says, if you're going to do it yourself, and if you're going to approach God through your own works and your own merits and keep all the rules and try to approach God that way, then you don't need Christ. Isn't that what he's saying? He's become of no effect to you, whosoever you are that's justified by the law. You've fallen from grace. See, I preach a lot about grace, and sometimes people argue and fuss with me. You wouldn't think so, but that's true. At the gas station, I'm pumping gas at Ampride, and a guy came up and wanted to talk about theology with me. I wanted to say, leave me alone. I just want to fill my car up. I don't want to come to church if you want to talk theology, you know. I get calls, and this seems to be the thing that upsets everybody. You know what most people want to do? Here's what most people want. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I'll tell you why after I tell you what they want. What most people want is for you to say, you do everything you can, and then Jesus will come along at the end, and anywhere, you know, any little bit that you fall short, He just makes up the difference. That's not what Paul's saying. He's saying it's either Him or me, not both. Did you notice that? And when I'm weak, that's when I'm strong. And I don't want to have my own righteousness. People don't like that, and I'll tell you why they don't like it. Paul says, where's boasting then in this message of grace? What can we boast about? Well, the answer is nothing. We have nothing to boast about. You know, in Ephesians 2:8, the famous verse, he said, by grace you're saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Right. And people don't want to give up that boasting. Nobody wants to say, I'm weak. Nobody wants to say, you know what we read there when Paul said, Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I am the main one. Most people don't want to say that. That's a humiliating thing to say. I don't mind saying it. I'll say it. I'm the main one that needed it, and needs it, does need it still. So people will say, oh, you talk about grace all the time. Don't you believe you can fall from grace? Oh yeah, I do. He says you can. If you turn around and say, I'm going to be justified by what I do in my own performance, and Paul said, in other words, you've stepped out of grace and you're going to do it yourself. It's either grace or work, but not both. Okay, now, Phil, back to chapter 3. I want to read the Message. After all that we've read, this will make sense to you. I just like some of the things he says here. I love the Message translation. You crazy Galatians, this is so funny what he says here. You crazy Galatians, Did someone put a hex on you? Have you taken a leave of your senses? See how frustrated he is? That's what I like about Paul. He's very real. I mean, this sounds like a real, vivid person. You can just picture him writing this. Have you taken a leave of your senses? Something crazy has happened. For it's obvious you no longer have the crucified Jesus in clear focus in your lives. See, if they're going around trying to say, I'm going to do this and that and the other thing and be justified before God, you've forgotten about Jesus dying for your sins. That's what he's saying. His sacrifice on the cross was certainly set before you clearly enough. In other words, that's what he did for them. Next one. Let me put this question to you. How did your new life begin? Good question, right? Was it by working your heads off to please God, or was it by simply responding to God's message to you? Well, we know, don't we? How do we start out? How do we become Christians? It was just by simply responding to his offer, just responding to his grace. That's what he's saying. Remember what got it started. Next verse. I love what he says here in the next verse in the message. Are you going to continue this crazy people? For only crazy people would think they could complete by their own efforts what was begun by God. No, you see, what this is saying is, it makes us powerless, really. We do have a part to play. We're supposed to believe on purpose. We're supposed to trust him and rely on him. That's why he said, my grace is sufficient for you. We're supposed to, that's a statement of I rely upon him. Only crazy people could think they could complete by their own efforts what was begun by God. If you weren't smart enough or strong enough to begin it, how do you suppose you could perfect it? Boy, this is really profound. If it took God, if it took God to get it started as a creator, to make you a new creation, how do you think you can improve upon his work? That's a profound thought. All we can say is, I'm weak, I'm powerless, he came to save sinners, and I'm the first one in line, and his grace is sufficient for me. That's a wonderful thought, if we could embrace that. And I don't mind embracing that myself. There's so many things in life about which I have no power. But I'm willing to say his grace is enough for me. Can I read you one more that I like? Romans chapter 4, just a few verses. Romans chapter 4 in the Message, Phil. This one is very similar, and I like what he says here. So how do we fit what we know of Abraham, our first father in the faith, into this new way of looking at things? It is a new way of looking at things. If Abraham, by what he did for God, got God to approve him, he could certainly have taken credit for it. Listen to this now. But the story we're given is a God story, not an Abraham story. It's about him and his work, not about us and our work. Our part is to believe and to trust him. Okay? What we read in Scripture is Abraham entered into what God was doing for him. That is so profound. You let that sink in on your thinking, because that applies to you and me in our lives too. Abraham entered into what God was doing for him. Now you might be tempted to say, well, what's God doing for me? Well, we just read it a while ago in Romans. If God be for us, who can be against us? Now, you could look at your life and say, well, what about all these things that are going wrong and all this trouble I have, all this frustration? Where is God in all of that? Well, Paul could have said the same thing. In fact, he kind of, if you read between the lines, he was saying the same thing. He was looking at all the things he was suffering, and he went to the Lord and prayed about all those things, and God had to refocus his attention. He said, Paul, all this stuff you're suffering, you need to get your eyes off that and look at me. My grace is sufficient for you. Yeah, you're weak, but my power is made perfect when you're weak. And Paul said, that changed my thinking. I'm going to say, I don't mind being weak now, because his power rests on me when I... See, that is a statement of faith. Is it not? If we could look out the door and see God working on our behalf, we wouldn't need to believe anything. But it takes faith to believe what we're told that he's doing, that he is for us. And then you might say, well, I don't deserve for him to be that for me. Oh yeah, that's right. That's why it's grace. That's why he says, my grace is sufficient. Yeah, but I've made mistakes. Oh yeah, of course, we all have. But his grace is not affected by our mistakes. It's what we don't deserve. He's for us even though we don't deserve. That's why he said, my grace, Paul, is sufficient for you. I wonder sometimes if Paul might have had a little pity party every now and then and said, oh man, what did I do to deserve this? Have you ever done that? I mean, and start thinking, I must have done something really bad to get this all this trouble. And it's like the Lord saying, I have grace for you, and my grace has nothing to do with what you deserve or not. I'm just for you. I think if you could hear the heart of God, he'd be saying, I'm for you because I love you. And then all those other things, I know everything about you, but I love you anyway. You see, Abraham entered into what God was doing for him. See, Abraham could not produce what God said was his will for him to have a child. He couldn't produce it. But Abraham just by faith believed God, we're told, right?